Okay, and we're recording 12:31. Well, let's get underway. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from, to hear from Hugh about Nansledan, a development on the south coast of England. My name is Harriet Wenberg, and I'm Executive Director of INTBAU, which is the charity founded 20 years ago to be a global network dedicated to creating better places to live through traditional building, architecture and urbanism. We're based in London, in the UK, but we have 34 national chapters in countries around the world and over 7,000 members. And it's completely free to join, to become a member, to have our newsletter, to know what workshops, summer schools, courses and other talks like these are taking place. So if you're not a member now, do please go to intbau.org after this talk and sign up for free, as I say. So it's now a great pleasure for me to be introducing Hugh, who is a director at Adam Architecture and a long-time member of INTBAU and a long-time friend as well. So we're really pleased that Hugh's going to speak about Nansledan today. I won't introduce Nansledan because that's obviously to be the subject of the talk, but Hugh is an architect and urban designer specializing in traditional design. He has an unusually broad and award-winning international portfolio of completed work, which includes new private and commercial buildings, alterations, extensions and repairs to listed and historic properties, urban and landed estate master planning, together with new housing developments of different scales. He also writes, lectures and teaches across the UK and overseas on a range of topics, which span both architecture and urban design, and collaborates on research projects with both academic and commercial partners. So a very varied career and a very fascinating place that we're about to hear about, and hoping from a really, really hot London that there'll be some images of the fantastic setting in which Nansledan sits, so we can all pretend we're by the sea. Thank you very much, Hugh. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be asked by INTBAU to come and do this lunchtime talk. I'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time hopefully at the end for some questions if people have anything they'd like to ask further about. The talk today really is about the design and delivery of better new places and ways in which one can encourage people to live more in more sustainable patterns of living. I want to start first by just asking, why is so much recent development really so bad and so uninspired? And I think there are various reasons for that. One of those reasons, in my mind anyway, is the bureaucratic monster which has evolved out of the 1948 Town and Country Planning Act. There are many good things that come out of planning, but over the last 70 years, there's been a proliferation of single interest groups, and the delay and cost of securing planning permission has got ever more profound. And all too often it becomes a race to the bottom as people desperately just try and get a permission to enable them to start building. On the left-hand side of this slide is a government survey done a few years ago now, looking at the change in the pattern of delivery of new housing from 2008 to 2015. And you can see, if you look at the darker blue colour on the right-hand side, that in 2008, about 30% of houses were delivered through volume house builders or PLC house builders. By 2015, that number had gone up to nearly 60%. And that is in part, anyway, because of the bureaucratic machine that they're all wrestling with, because it's just so expensive and so difficult to secure planning. Only those with the deepest pockets can afford to embark on that journey. And the product of PLC and volume house builders is inevitably a more globalized and formulaic approach. So this next image is just to give you a flavour of things that happen all too often in the UK. Houses that really could be anywhere. They're all often very bland without any distinctive features, and everything is focused upon securing a short-term financial return rather than looking at the quality of place. And just diving into a matter of detail, you'll see many of these houses have these ugly white boxes on the front, housing gas meters with individual supplies up to the apartments on the upper floor. And all too often in the UK, meters are just bunged on the front elevation without any thought about the public realm and the impact that they have. Everything is driven by price, and it's the price per square foot, so it's maximising the amount of built volume on a piece of land for the sales receipt, not about the place that they're creating and the added value that can come through good placemaking, which we'll come back to later on. And so all too often these new developments are just layouts minimizing the amount of road and maximizing the amount of built form and minimizing the amount of infrastructure required. It's all done to the lowest possible common denominator. Now, another aspect, we're looking at, obviously, as a nation and as a global economy, how we can reduce our carbon emissions. And there's a move towards zero carbon homes. My own view is a lot of the government policy on zero carbon is focused on houses, not on lower carbon lifestyles. And indeed, for Nansledan, as part of the R&D, we went to Hanover with the Building Research Establishment to look at passive house, which I show you on the top right-hand side of this screen, to look at zero carbon houses in Germany. And whilst the ambition there was the bottom left-hand side image of a low carbon lifestyle, they built these passive houses in Hanover on the edge of the city where there's really nothing to do. And so, like on the bottom right-hand slide, you have to use your Volkswagen to go everywhere. And as we now know, Volkswagens are not very low carbon in themselves. And so whilst the building may be zero carbon, the pattern of life is not. And I think we need to look more holistically at how we can achieve both to, if we are going to make a difference to the climate change that we're now experiencing. And the result of a number of these phenomena is that development all too often is extremely unpopular. And that, of course, adds to the political pressure and makes it even more difficult to secure planning consent. And I call this my vicious circle. So if we start at the bottom with the formulaic approach to globalized development brought about by PLC house builders, that makes development unpopular, which in turn creates political pressure, which in turn adds to yet more regulation, so increasing the cost of permission and reducing the number of developers to those who are the wealthiest who can afford to take the system on. And it becomes a downward spiral to create ever lower quality, in my mind. Another problem, speaking frankly, all too often are architects. Very few architects actually engage with commercial housing in any kind. They often crow from the sides, and often too they think they know better than normal people, if you like, and that they pronounce upon them. And interestingly, a few years ago, Create Streets, if you're not familiar with Create Streets, they're an absolutely excellent organisation looking at how to improve the quality of public realm. And they undertook a survey looking at 4 recent housing schemes. The top 2 have been not acknowledged by any architectural awards whatsoever. And the 2 lower schemes were ones that architects thought were fantastic, and they'd given each other lots of awards for them. And they polled members of the public which ones they thought were the best of these 4. And the results showed very clearly that non-architects dramatically preferred options 1 and 2, and the options 3 and 4, the ones that the architects liked, were extremely unpopular, relatively speaking. And so the conclusion was that architectural awards are a good indicator of popularity, but only actually if you invert them. In parallel with all of this, patterns of living are changing. This is a piece of research that our practice undertook some years ago with a developer partner, looking at the emerging social trends for the 18 to 34-year-old cohort. This is available on our website if you wanted to look at it later on. We can send you a copy. But some of the summaries were that the younger generation, more and more of them are living in cities for longer or for their whole lives rather than moving out of the country as earlier generations aspired to do. And more of them are working for themselves and working from home. And my own view is that some of the fallout from COVID will accelerate some of these trends ever more. At the same time, I think there are things that we can learn from things that have happened in the past. The slide I show you here is 18th century Bath, planned by the landowner. You see on the right-hand side the master plan for one of the most famous parts of Bath, Queen Square, on the bottom of the slide, with the road going up to the circus, Gay Street up to the circus, and then going along Brock Street to the Royal Crescent. And the top left-hand slide shows the front elevation of Royal Crescent, one of the great masterpieces of English urban design from a set-piece perspective. And so the landowner regulated the master plan and the public realm elevation of that development, and individual buyers could buy plots, and they had to build the front elevation, but behind that they could do whatever they liked. And so the back of Queen Square, I show you on the bottom left-hand side, and you can see it's a complete riot, everyone doing their own thing, but it doesn't matter. It's the public realm which matters to create order and make a coherent place. At this point, we must all acknowledge our debt to the brilliant Leon Krier for his clear thinking and the way in which he articulated some of the fundamental ideas of what make good places, which we all rely on and I think agree on across the world. On the left-hand side is sketches to show the importance of the integration of the public realm with the private realm to make a civilized town. And on the right-hand side, how the cities develop over time. All too often, as we know, certainly in Britain, this happens through what he calls over-expansion, with this endless suburbs on feeding on a historic town centre. Over time, that becomes unsustainable, and a much better way of growing is through duplication, where you get new sub-town centres clustered around the historic town centre, and each sub-town centre becomes a mixed-use place in itself. So that's shown on the top left-hand side on this slide. And these other three perspectives show the importance of a coherent architectural language. On the top right-hand side, you've got a consistent architectural character, which helps to create a very clear hierarchy of buildings, so you know which ones are important public, which are private buildings. And the two lower slides show that when you start to introduce alien architectural vocabularies, the quality and coherence of the space starts to erode. And at Poundbury, on the edge of Dorchester and Dorset, was where Leo got a chance to put into practice some of these ideas he was developing. And you can see that it's through duplication with a new western quarter on the edge of Dorchester, with its own sub-centre, which is Queen Mother Square, which has now been built, reinforcing also local identity, and most importantly, creating a dense, mixed-use, walkable neighbourhood, which is in itself revolutionised planning in the UK. I would also point out briefly also that the relief road around the edge of Dorchester goes around the south side of Poundbury and then up on the western side. This is quite an old slide now, but one of the ambitions at the start of Poundbury was to create one job per household. They've now built over 1,600 homes, I believe, but the number of jobs per household is well in excess of one per house. And they're building it at a relatively slow rate of 100 houses a year, because that's the rate at which the local economy can absorb houses into the market, and the rate at which local suppliers can keep up with the demand of the house builders. Earlier this year, the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission for the British government published the report on the left-hand side of this slide, Living with Beauty, looking at ways in which the built environment could be improved. And shortly afterwards, Knight Frank produced these two research papers, Building in Beauty and Cost and Value, and they look at a number of examples, including Poundbury. So if you want up-to-date information about what's going on in Poundbury, these are the best sources to refer to. But I can tell you that by a mile, Poundbury outperforms any other development in the UK at the moment in terms of creating an integrated mixed-use environment with a significant number of jobs, as well as creating new houses and adding value to the local economy. So on to Nansledan. So Nansledan started in 2003 when I got involved. There'd been some early discussion before that, but really it started getting going in earnest in 2003. And just to orientate those of you that don't know where Newquay is, a plan of the UK showing London and Dorchester where Poundbury is, and then Newquay on the extreme southwest of Britain on the North Atlantic coast of Cornwall. So the ambition at Nansledan was to build on the success of Poundbury, and it was from the outset been a partnership between the local authority and the landowner. Newquay at that time had a population of about 22,000 residents in the winter, growing up to 110,000 in the summer, and it was the whole economy of the town was reliant on high volume, low spending tourism, and frankly where they all slept it was better not to ask. It was run down, it was impoverished, and at the outset of the Nansledan project, the local authority encouraged the landowner to take a 50-year vision, a long-term vision, to help regenerate the economy of the town by adding a significant urban extension. Newquay is an historic place. On the right-hand side, I show you an aerial view of the town. Just off the slide to the left is the historic fishing harbour. In the 19th century, a railway line was built across Cornwall, creating a second chapter in the town's history for a minerals port. A lot of minerals come out of Cornwall, and they historically were taken round Land's End, around the western side of the UK, up to the ports in the Midlands. But that's quite rough sea, and a lot of ships were lost through that process. So building the railway line was a way of alleviating that issue. It had a second career then as a minerals port. In the early 20th century, the lovely beaches you can see on this aerial view gave it a third career as an upmarket holiday destination. And over the course of the 20th century, as surfing became more popular, it also became the surf capital of the UK. And now, frankly, it's the teenage love capital of the Southwest as well, with the number of people going there in the summer months. you can see in this picture, and also one I'm going to show you in a minute, that much of this town was developed in the 20th century with little monocultural suburban housing estates, rather like Leon Krier's diagram to show the historic town centre on the left-hand side of that aerial view, just encrusted with a whole load of suburban housing estates around it. So at the outset of Nansledan, the landowner, the duchy, identified 10 key principles which it's used to guide it in everything it's done over that period. Everything was going to be led by public consultation. It would be guided by a master plan, a long-term strategic master plan. Everything would be informed by sustainability and wanting to lead by example to create a better low carbon lifestyle place for people to live. It should reflect local identity. It would use Cornish resources wherever possible. It would respond to the indigenous needs of the town, relate properly to Newquay and work with the people of Newquay. It would mitigate environmental impact, use land efficiently, and most importantly, of course, it should be viable as well. So this plan is a slightly easy one of seeing the historic town centre where the old harbour is on the left-hand side or west side of the town as you see this plan, and then the housing estates become more apparent from the 20th century on the east side of the current built area. The red line shows the area of search for Nansledan on a big broad valley to the east of the existing town. Nansledan in Cornish means wide valley, and the clues in the name that really much characterises the landform. At the bottom of the valley is the Chapel stream, and on the south side, on the white land, there's the railway line that I mentioned that goes through to the historic harbour. The yellow land is all owned by the duchy, and the white land within the red line is owned by, or was owned by 10 other landowners who've now boiled themselves down to 3. I'd also point out a little parcel of yellow land on the left-hand side of the screen, which is an area known as Trigonal Hill, where we had a chance to test some of the ideas before embarking on the main event. I'll come back to that a bit later. The way that the duchy approached Nansledan was initially to commission a suite of vision documents, which I show you here: the Inquiry by Design report by the Prince's Foundation, an overarching sustainability strategy, energy strategy, a food strategy. 23% of your food is your carbon footprint is what you eat. So that's really important. The green infrastructure strategy, the pattern book, which we'll come back to, the master plan, a water strategy, transport strategy, and then the building code, which is the mechanism to regulate delivery of those visions. And the duchy entered into a common aspiration contract with 3 regional non-PLC house builders, which required them legally to deliver this vision in what got built. And the landowner, in this case the duchy, have complete control at each stage of the design. So they sign off the planning drawings and the working drawings, and then the finished building. Only when the finished building is being signed off can it be sold to a third party. And if you buy a house at Nansledan, you're then required to sign up to a design and community code, which regulates what you can do to the public realm ever after. And that again is based upon the same principles that the vision documents drew upon in the first instance. And the evidence is that people actually like this extra regulation. It creates added value because it gives them security. The public realm will be kept nicely in perpetuity. This model works also with a phase sale of land, so typical phases of 100 plots per phase. So the house builders can draw down the land incrementally. And so as needs change over time, they can adapt what they're producing to suit the market at any one moment. So the pattern book I mentioned earlier on was the first thing that my practice did. This page looks at urban typologies, in this case the existing high street of the historic part of the town, looking at the size and scale of the main square, the size and scale of streets, the scale of buildings that define those streets, trying to get under the skin of the place to understand what makes it special and distinctive, so we can then use those attributes later on to create new parts of Newquay that feel like they belong to the North Atlantic coast. The second part of the pattern book looks at building typologies. On steep sloping ground, the double-fronted house, the three-window wide house, is very common on the North Atlantic coast. It involves minimal excavation and creates a shallow house with a wide front. It gives this very distinctive form. And so I show a number of examples on the top left-hand side, the other ones elsewhere in Newquay, some with bays, some without, but the same generic house form, looking at their attributes, dimensions, and so on. We looked in addition at the key details and materials used to define each of those typologies, looking at also dimensions and proportions to try again capture in a way that can be used by designers in due course, the characteristics that make those buildings distinctive in that North Atlantic environment. We looked also at the palette of materials, quite limited in Cornwall. Not many trees grow there very well, so a lot of the materials are quite hard, the granite and the slate, but there's not a huge palette and not much scope for elaboration of detail. A lot of it's quite simple and tough in its character, but all more beautiful for that in some ways. And the pattern book also looked at the kinds of plants that thrive in a maritime environment too. At the outset, Leon Krier came to Cornwall and did this very helpful analysis of Newquay. He identified it was built effectively on 3 hills. On the top right-hand side, you can see the historic town centre with the increasing suburbanisation on the 2 blocks of land to the right there. On the bottom left-hand slide, the ambition to create new sub-centres that took some of the pressure off the historic town centre. And then looking at the bottom right-hand side, how this might manifest itself in the longer term to create a more sustainable pattern for the wider town of Newquay before looking at the next level of fine detail. Sorry. This is the first layer of the master plan, if you like, looking effectively at the movement network. A master plan really at this stage is a movement network. It's looking at where the main streets and secondary streets go and the parcels for development. And then later on you can look at those parcels in more detail as each phase comes forward. The red lines indicate the primary roads, and you can see unlike Poundbury, where the new road goes around the edge of the development, at Nansledan we wanted it to go through the centre of the development to produce heat for passing traffic to warm up the economic new sub-centre that we're creating in the middle of the town, just over the Chapel stream. And the blue lines are the secondary streets, and thereafter the tertiary streets are just left in white, and those positions will change around a bit over time as they need to, as each block comes forward. The green infrastructure is by and large pushed to the edge because of the severe weather of the North Atlantic in the winter particularly. Traditional Cornish towns have quite tight streets and are quite hard, and that gives you protection from the Atlantic weather, but then you get the opportunity for significant green infrastructure around the edge. And there are some other attributes in the middle of the site which are important too. We've kept those, you can see it's highlighted in green. We'll come back to those in a minute. The ambition was to create 4,000 homes here with 4,000 jobs, so like Poundbury, 1 job per household, and of those 30% would be affordable in tenure blind clusters. In our practice we have some software called Place Logic, and we ran a Place Logic analysis of the master plan at an early stage to look at the desirability of particular routes. Those which are most desirable are in red, going down to blue with the ones which are the quietest, and we can make sure then that each of the new sub-centres within Nansledan can sit on a hot crossroads, if you like, to ensure that we optimise the chances of passing traffic to make the commercial sub-centres viable. We sometimes joke we're not very good at maths. We have 6 quarters or 6 urban quarters at Nansledan. Each of those are shown here. There are 5 on the screen. The last one is an area known as Hendra on the south side of the bottom side of the slide, which for the road coming in from the south, which is not identified properly on this particular slide. Within 5 minutes walk of each of the sub-centres, people will live, so they can always walk to a shop to go and get a pint of milk and to do their daily business. And it's a 10-minute walk to the new sub-town centre identified as Nansledan on that slide as well. Looking at street names, the idea was to give it a local resonance. So on the one hand, we've got Mallory's work of the Mort d'Arthur with place names and people's names from that going in one direction. In the other direction, local place names to create a coherent weft and walk. And again, this can be used to help people orientate themselves within the fabric of the town. I mentioned sustainability. The focus is on a low carbon lifestyle, not just the buildings. Both are important, as I say. Creating the dense mixed-use walkable neighbourhoods is really important. Putting pedestrians and cyclists first and putting cars second. Making sure we've got good public transport, super fast broadband to every home to encourage home working and to help the little local businesses. A fabric first approach to buildings with additional air tightness and insulation. Setting up long-term local supply chains for natural materials. Using materials from recycled components elsewhere in Cornwall. Buildings, where possible, having at least one elevation where solar technology can be fitted later on or now if they want to. Using the street trees to help the shading on south-facing streets. Making sure the buildings are beautiful so that people want to keep them well and look after them rather than tear them down and rebuild them after a short period of time. making sure buildings are flexibly built as well to allow for internal reorganisation as needs change over time, and then encouraging local food production too. The Common Aspiration Contract enables us to set up long-term supply chains of local materials, labour and building components, including Cornish slate, Cornish granite, windows, Cornish concrete blocks made from recycled China clay waste, and the landscape contractors, and making sure that the plants are also supplied from Cornish suppliers. The idea is to spend as much money in the local economy so that the economic warmth created by the development goes back into the local economy, rather than going abroad or further away where it has less impact and less benefit to the existing residents of the town and the hinterland. Every house on these sorts of schemes produces 100 cubic metres of spoil, and normally that would go up country in lorries to landfill, which is not cheap, and it's also not popular with the outlying hamlets and villages, because they get 40 years of lorries going through their settlement, taking this muck away to other places. By keeping the spoil on the edge of the development, you can create, as we are here, a new piece of green infrastructure, a series of terraces like you might see in Provence or Italy, with community orchards and allotments and another civic amenity. It also, you can't build on made up ground, so that the neighbouring villages know that they're never going to have coalescence of their settlement with Nansledan. And it also saves a significant amount of money compared with taking the muck away too, so a much more sustainable solution. And where possible, we're always looking at Nansledan for making these virtuous circles. We've been working with the RSPB, looking at how we can improve the ecology through everything we're doing. So every house has on average one swift box. Swift box is the most flexible kind of bird box used by other species as well. So there's one of those at least per house, looking at creating habitats for bats and other animals of various kinds, not only within the built form areas, but also on the significant green infrastructure spaces on the periphery of the built area of the Nansledan too. There's an edible streets strategy. So much of the public realm planting, both by way of fruit trees and also front gardens, is made with planted with edible forms. And you'll notice on the right-hand side the bee bricks shown next to the espaliered apple tree there to improve pollination. There's a number of community orchards, which the first one of which is on high ground. I'll show you on the top right-hand side there, on an area known as the Common, and the orchard there is used as a way of integrating existing residents of Newquay with those new members coming into Nansledan. It's proved extremely popular with all aspects of society there, and is also we've got a number of allotments there too. We've evolved a model for allotments on Nansledan, where we have these residential urban squares, which I show you two examples of on the top two images, with 3/4 of them being allotments for growing your own food, and then 1/4 being a play space, so you can take your child to the swings or the slide while you go and tend your vegetables. Every scheme of this scale needs what's known as SANG, Strategic Alternative Natural Green Space, and the requirement is it's effectively a country walk where you have a circular kind, where in essence you can go and empty your dog. Many of them elsewhere in the country are literally no more than that. They're not uplifting places. The Duchy was fortunate in owning the farm on the edge of Nansledan, and so the ambition there is to create a more inspirational kind of SANG. So the improved grassland there is being impoverished again to encourage the reintroduction of indigenous wildflowers, to create these wildflower meadows, which you can see this is the first spring we've gone back in that direction. These pictures come from I think in May this year, and in time, in fact, later on this year, there'll be a herd of Red Devon beef cattle, which is the sort of a kind of cattle one finds in the southwest of the UK, will be introduced onto this SANG. Beef, Red Devon don't mind people with dogs walking amongst them as well, so it'll be a really lovely place to take your dog for a walk, and you're also going to be enjoying the wildflower meadows, and in time the beef cattle can also be used as another source of local food. We've been working with Andy Cameron, who many of you will know, who wrote the government's manual for streets. And one of the innovations he brought to the project was, in terms of creating this pedestrian hierarchy over vehicles, is making sure that the pavements on the main streets are continuous in their level, and that people coming off the main street into a side street go up and over the pavement and down into the side street, so making cars stop and wait for pedestrians. As I say, it's delivered in phases of approximately 100 houses each. Phasing always changes, but you can see a version of a phasing plan on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, showing how we work with different designers to make sure that every street has a variety of hands upon it, but without every house being designed by someone different, which becomes a nightmare to coordinate. This is a more detailed block plan of the first 4 phases, and I'd point out on the left, well, on the right-hand side, sorry, there's what we call a square about. It's a roundabout with the existing road network where the high street connects to that. That will be, I'll show you a slide in a minute, but it will have an obelisk in the middle, and the edges are defined by 4 Art Deco mixed-use buildings. There's a large green garden square on the high street, you can see, with the cross paths on it. On the bottom of the built area there, you can see the first of our residential squares with the allotments and play space. And on the top of the slide, another pink area with a triangular space. That's the first of our local centres with mixed-use buildings around the little public space there, which we'll come back to in a minute as well. Here's an aerial view of phase 1, which was finished now some years ago. You can get a better flavour of the square about there with the first 2 Art Deco buildings and the roundabout being defined by the obelisk, rather than just being the usual over-engineered piece of highways design. And on this slide, I show you the photographs of the top of the high street with the first 2 Art Deco buildings and the obelisk you can see as well. And then the top left-hand slide shows a view of the top of the high street going down the hill. And now you can see that in fact, in that view, you can see that the diggers are beginning to move in to build the other side of that road, which will again improve its character and give you a much better sense of how it will look in the longer term. We're very meticulous in having street character codes for each phase of development. So we used the appropriate building type to define each of the street types. And these houses are all standard house builder houses, but with bespoke front public realm elevations and bespoke details, which limits the abnormal cost. We're also working very carefully with Andy Cameron and our other highways engineers at AWP to make sure that the streets are kept as tight as possible, not only to make them feel like Cornish streets, but to provide that protection from the Atlantic weather, and also to promote pedestrians and cycle movement over that of cars, and without the need for a huge amount of signage. On the primary streets, we would typically add an extra 300 millimetres of ceiling height on the ground floor, which helps to give those buildings more stature to reinforce the importance of the primary streets. But it also means over time, if needs change, that the ground floor of these townhouses can be converted to more commercial use as well. And again, we use the appropriate architectural character through our street character codes to make sure that there are more elaborate buildings on the primary streets and more restrained buildings, as you might see on the top right-hand side, on the secondary and tertiary streets, where really there's hardly any detail at all, very much in the Cornish tradition, and relying often on strong use of colour to create that lovely character. This again is a view of the north side of the top part of the high street, and the grass in the foreground is now being built on. Also within our street character codes, we regulate the character of the front gardens with different kinds of railings for different kinds of streets, different amounts of setback, and most of the front gardens have got some kind of edible plant in there, in part of our food strategy. And you can see on the top right-hand side, there's some houses built up to the edge of one of the original farm tracks that link to settlements there, so keep the character of that where we can, to make that as soft as possible. And on the bottom left-hand side, a little mews street, which is quite hard, very much in the Cornish tradition, but with people using little pockets of planting and then flower pots to create a bit of character to those in an appropriate way. Last year we built the new primary school. It was the first new school built in Cornwall for 30 years. It was the same build price per square foot as a normal local authority school, but putting it on 2 stories made it much more economical to build, so we could spend more money on beautiful architecture. It's a very significant building on the edge of Nansledan to help define the edge of the town for the long term, next to green space and allotments to help enrich the children's education, understanding about the green environment and on where their food comes from, and making sure it's a walk to school environment so people don't have to get their car to take their child to school. You can notice also on the bottom right hand side the swift boxes under the eaves in clusters. This is the first of our local centres I mentioned a few minutes ago at Gusty Vure. We had 14 units, little 600 square foot commercial space underneath apartments clustered around this little triangular square. We were quite nervous when we started building because it was a big commitment to create as much commercial space at one moment. But in the event, all 14 units were either sold or rented off plan. And we now have a waiting list for another 14 local businesses who want the next square we're going to bring forward before too long as well. It's in aggregate now, we've been on site for about 6 years, and it is becoming to feel a sense for being a proper place rather than just a development. It hasn't developing its own character and its own distinct identity. A couple of years ago, Create Streets did a review of Nansledan, and the fact is that it's grown because of the approach the Duchy have taken from an allocation of 400 houses to the 4,000 houses, which it now enjoys. And so Create Streets did this piece of research to see what makes development like this popular, something which doesn't happen very often, as I said at the outset of this talk, elsewhere. I mentioned Trigonal Hill, which was 174 houses we built before we started at Nansledan. It was a chance to test some of the ideas I've been sharing with you this afternoon. This was our original vision, effectively trying to make a traditional piece of the town on some leftover paddocks on the edge of the centre of the historic town. These are some aerial photographs taken soon after it was finished. One of these made it onto the front cover of the government's white paper, Planning for the Future, last week. There's been a slightly mixed reaction to those. Some architects have been sniping at it, saying there are no trees. Well, the reality is on the North Cornish coast that trees generally don't grow very well, and you need the microclimate of the built form before trees can start to become established. And that is now happening. So more recent photographs will show that it's becoming a greener place too. Trigonal Hill provided a chance for us to experiment with Art Deco as another kind of the vernacular, if you like, of the seaside vernacular, a cheaper way of building bigger buildings than has been the case at Poundbury with more conventional traditional buildings, and sitting quite comfortably alongside the Cornish vernacular as well, in our view, and also to see the appetite for these little commercial units of 600 square feet, which again have been incredibly popular there too. And this is all the more challenging in Cornwall because the economic values there are more challenging than Poundbury and Dorset. So in our minds, if we can do it at Cornwall, we can do it in many other places across the UK as well. Trigonal Hill was a chance to test the ideas about street hierarchy and how we can use the building typology and the palette of materials to reinforce different kinds of street to make it a more distinctive place, one which is easier to navigate. You might notice also that there's minimal street signage here, which is a breakthrough with dealing with the Highways Department of Cornwall Council, working with them to minimise clutter in street signage, and also no gas meters on the front elevations, as happens at Poundbury. And this again is a sort of a complete volte-face from what normally happens on development, where meters litter the public realm and help to erode that character of place you're trying to create. There's a chance also to explore local materials and details. On the bottom left-hand side, Callywith stone, hung slate, and otherwise painted render, and to try different kinds of paint until we found one that didn't fall off with the salt-laden wind from the Atlantic. At the end of the streets, we have what you might call stopper buildings. There are a number of streets, very few buildings, which have expensive elevations, usually either stone or hung slate, and they tend to be these stopper buildings at the end of the street where you get a lot of visual impact in the wider urban fabric without loading up the scheme with too many abnormal costs. 30% of the buildings, I say, are affordable. One of these 4 houses is an affordable house. And in case you're wondering, it's the one on the bottom right-hand side. So all the affordable housing is completely tenure blind, and it's in a cluster with apartment blocks next to it, so the parking is shared, but otherwise you have no idea that it was not an open market house. Here's a more recent photograph of the residential square within Trigonal Hill, and you can see the trees are now beginning to take off, and the Pittosporum hedge is also beginning to become established, making it a much softer, more interesting place. There's a chance to explore also a strict hierarchy of details, in this case with door surrounds, from cottages with no door surround through to granite lintels or painted margins or various kinds of hood or door canopy. And in our mind, this again reinforces typology and helps to make the streets and the buildings more distinctive and to create that appropriate hierarchy within a consistent architectural vocabulary. Throughout all of this, the Prince takes a huge personal interest, visiting regularly and constantly sharing in ideas and wanting feedback on how things have gone, and very anxious at all times to lead by example. And it's been a great privilege to work alongside him and the Duchy over the last 18 years on Nansledan, and I think we're always learning. We never think we have everything under control. There's always new challenges and new things to pick up and to learn from. A few years ago, the Prince's Foundation produced this report, Building a Legacy, which I think is still available on their website. And some of the house builders from Nansledan to get produced information from their sales figures. And in essence, they're typically about 10% more expensive to build, but the added sales price achieved from the bigger houses was also about 10% more, so an increased margin on those. But the smaller houses, which are more desirable in Cornwall, sold for typically between 50 and 20% premium too. So there was an incentive in terms of getting better value to invest a bit more money in better public realm materials and better design. We've also been analysing the resale values in Trigonal Hill over the last few years, and over a 3-year window, it's grown over 9% a year of added value through measured through resale, whereas a PLC built house scheme built in the same town at the same time frame was achieving barely over 1% a year. So over 3 years, we're getting effectively a 25% premium over the local market because of the better quality of design and placemaking achieved. So in summary, the key points, I think, for how to do this better: a dedicated landowner with a long-term interest in the development with a strong vision, an holistic approach to sustainability centered on low carbon lifestyle, ongoing consultation because there's always a need to adapt and change to meet local need, the long-term flexible master plan, the use of covenants and common aspiration agreements to tie everyone together to make sure the objectives are common, the consortium of non-PLC house builders who are much more flexible and adaptable and can add commercial acumen but working in concert with the landowner's vision, learning from the local vernacular to create buildings and urban spaces that feel like they belong in that part of the world, setting up local supply chains, and I think in a post-COVID world that will also be more resilient way of going about building and relying on materials coming in from overseas, and then the slow, steady phase pattern of delivery which is in tune with the local market and the capacity of the local labour and suppliers, creating local jobs and added value and a distinctive place that responds to the established character and the evolving needs of the community. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Hugh. As soon as if you end your screen share now, I think then we'll have more of a view back of well, ourselves, I guess it's us with video. Thank you. That was just a really fascinating look at the entire history of the project, but grounding it also in Poundbury and the precedent that had come before. So to have that full sweep of the narrative was really, really interesting. We're going to open it up to questions now from anyone who is here who has something they'd like to ask of Hugh. Do just type it into the chat box at the bottom. And for that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Jules Butler, who's the Programme and Communications Coordinator for INTBAU, but perhaps just to lead things off whilst people get their thoughts together and get typing. Hugh, I think you described in the 18 years some of the key players that there had been, so in terms of the Duchy as landowner and local sort of Cornwall Council, the architects, the local community, obviously, of course, as well, quite a sort of, a complex set of players to be involved. And whether things, over the 18 years that it's been going, the project, that have worked very well in terms of people having been in post for a long time, so they had a vested interest in seeing the project all the way through. Were there things that have worked sort of especially well about the team that you've had working on this?
I mean, in all projects, the right people are very important. And as I mentioned, the PLC the house builders wouldn't have had the right kind of people who want to engage in a project like this. Often they have a very high turnover of staff. We've been very blessed, really, that the site managers for each of the house builders have been there from the outset. Most of them bought houses actually on the development too, so they're not only working there, but they're part of the local community. And I think people are attracted there because of the strong vision that the Duchy have proposed, which seems very much in tune with the lifestyle people want to lead often in Cornwall. Being outside, being able to enjoy the quality of place that they're in, responding to the idea of edible streets, enriching the ecology. Those are all things very attractive to the community there, making it easy to work from home. It seems very much in tune with the sort of mood of people in that part of the country. And I think increasingly what will happen elsewhere in the post-COVID world, people are reevaluating the quality of where they live and the kind of lifestyle that they want to lead. And I think Another key aspect is never thinking you know all the answers, because you never do. A lot of architects think they know about everything, but they don't actually. And I've learned an enormous amount by just taking time to talk to people, and with all the local suppliers of granite and slate and so on, understanding how their operation works, what they can do economically, what they can't do economically, and how we can work with them to make their business more robust and resilient, and to help them secure their long-term future and create local jobs. And of course, in return, we get beautiful materials that look great on the scheme and add value both in placemaking terms, but also in character terms too. So it's everything. It's very much about collaboration, looking for those virtuous circles, so everyone benefits in the longer term.
Virtuous circles in the title as well of the talk. That's great. Thank you. And I see we've got some questions coming in. So over to you, Jules.
Thanks very much, Harriet, and thank you, Hugh. Fascinating talk. We'll start off, I think, with a question from Sam. So Sam is asking, what are the economic consequences of adopting a pattern book as planning regulation design code for new large-scale greenfield developments compared to brownfield infill developments in established urban areas? And could you point, Sam, to any current studies, please?
Well, pattern books can be used anywhere. It was an idea that really evolved in America, I think, in recent times. And we worked at the outset of Nansledan with Urban Design Associates in the US to understand how American pattern books worked. In America, often the pattern books there are effectively recodifying buildings that came from catalogues in the first instance. So it was an easier way of recodifying them, whereas in Cornwall we were trying to recodify the vernacular, which lent a slightly different approach to what we were trying to do. As a firm, we've now evolved more efficient ways of undertaking pattern book studies, looking at the different aspects, as I mentioned in the talk earlier, looking at the urban character and the architectural character too. And those apply equally to a regeneration scheme on brownfield land as they would to on greenfield land. And we've applied them to all scales, from 30 or 40 house schemes right up to these multi-thousand schemes too. And we've also found them a very effective way at galvanizing local enthusiasm for development at all. At Nansledan, people were very depressed about their town and what you could possibly do there to make it any better. And when we presented the pattern book back to them, they often acknowledged they hadn't really looked above the shop fronts there to look at the quality of buildings that were there and the kind of place that Newquay had been. And it opened their eyes often for the first time of some of the things that they had in the town, which were quite special. And then showing them through examples, how you can do better things again. As I've mentioned, by working with house builders to fuse their standard house plan with bespoke details on the public elevations. It's a limited cost way of improving the quality of public realm and making it a better place. So I can't particularly cite any urban regeneration schemes or brownfield sites off the top of my head, but I'm sure they're happening across the country. And I think that the mood of government generally is looking towards coding and trying to learn from local places to reinforce local identity in these sorts of ways.
Great, thank you, Hugh. We have another more straightforward question, I think, from Richard, who's asking what control there is in the development about car parking.
A great question. Car parking, whenever you have a public consultation, it's always the highways officer that gets, the highways engineer that gets the rough time, because everyone's paranoid about car parking. We try and limit the impact of cars on the development in terms of the streets. The streets are narrow and twisty so that people can't drive fast down them. They don't need to use a car everyday life because they can walk everywhere or go on a bicycle. But we do provide each house with the right number of car parking spaces so that they have somewhere to leave their car or cars without clattering up the street. We don't have, where we can avoid it, don't have yellow lines or other ways of doing it. It's usually under through peer group pressure, people respecting each other and not parking their cars in the wrong place. There are some on-street parking areas. There's also a lot of courtyard parking in what they call perimeter block development. So the houses go around the edge of the urban block. And in the middle of it, there's a car parking area with garages and parking spaces. Like Poundbury, every parking court has overlooked entrances and exits, more than one in most cases, and often has what's called a flat over a garage, a fog, or a house within the parking court too. So it's not just a backland area, it's part of the urban fabric, and people are encouraged to walk through it as they go from A to B as well. All the services go into the back of houses, so the parking courts are also where the sort of nerve centres for each urban block for gas meters and infrastructure go, and they're also used for the crates for the SUDs, the Sustainable Urban Drainage crates as well. So the urban form works really quite hard with that sort of centralized car parking concept to accommodate cars in a way which keeps them away from cluttering up the streets more than they need to. All the garages are overscaled to encourage people to keep their cars in garages. Also making sure there's room for a surfboard, very important, and bicycles and garden furniture and so on too. So you get often developers make garages so small you wouldn't put a car inside there, but we make sure they're overscaled so there's plenty of room that you can actually keep things stored neatly. And then on more recent phases, we found from the earlier phases that white vans were a problem in some areas, and so making sure some parking spaces are overscaled, that the white vans again can be kept off the streets in parking courts. And within the design and community code, which I mentioned in relation to common aspiration, if you buy a house there, you sign up to a set of covenants where you can and can't park. So you can't leave a caravan, for example, on a street or in a parking court area. So you can regulate through the covenants how people behave and where they do park. You do it that way rather than just slapping signs up everywhere. At Trigonal Hill, we did have an issue because it was close to the beautiful beaches. People were coming to park their car on Trigonal Hill and walk to the beach rather than paying to put their car in a car park. And so there we have now got a residence parking scheme that Cornwall Council instigated to way of regulating the car parking. But Nansledan hasn't been that much of a problem hitherto.
Fantastic. Quite a nice question here, which I might, if I may, add a little bit onto at the end. So what's your greatest enjoyment of being involved in the project? Does it change as the years go by? And having just sort of survived 5 months of lockdown, does that sort of alter your perspective about having been involved in this?
I mean, as I said, it's been a huge privilege really all the way through, and I've learned an enormous amount from it. I think the people are one of the most exciting things. The people I'm working with are just so interesting and intelligent and so generous with their thoughts and time, and everything we do is done through collaboration. So there's a very strong motivation that binds us all together, to deliver that vision that we've been asked to do. I love working with the craftsmen and with the local quarries and so on. I think that just seeing how you can use their materials in creative ways is really rewarding as well. Seeing how popular the scheme has become has been a real shot in the arm too. Off the back of that, we've got other schemes elsewhere in the country with other landed estates, and now also with one or two local authorities and with pension funds, people who are waking up to the long-term financial benefits of this approach that we might call the patient approach to delivering better places, not trying to get a maximum return in the short term, but building value over time through creating better places too. So each time I go there, it's like having my birthday again, really, because things happen so quickly that going to see things you've thought about for so long being built and seeing how people react to them is very uplifting too. And occasionally things don't go quite to plan, and you obviously learn from those too, so you don't make the same mistake twice, hopefully.
Great. No, that's a lovely answer. Thank you. And I think we're slightly running out of time, so I'll finish on this last question, if that's okay. And it might answer a couple of your questions coming through on the chat. So Chris is asking, what are the chances of this being possible elsewhere? Because obviously the Dutch is quite unique. So do you have any insight into how it might be replicated? People
sometimes say, both at Poundbury and now at Nansledan, it's just a sort of rich man's dream. It's an indulgence, if you like, and it's not possible to do it elsewhere. And I'll just point out the Dutch is regulated by the Treasury, so that they have to make sure it is viable, because they have to make sure that they are getting good value for their land. And I think by doing it in this slow way and selling land in parcels over time, the sales price per square foot does creep up. And so in the longer term, they probably make as much money or more money they would have made if they sold it to a PLC house builder on day one. So I think the economic models are becoming better understood. Those two Knight Frank reports I mentioned that came out in February this year are incredibly valuable in my mind, because they do lay out these sorts of thoughts in more detail. And I think in my own mind, the more objective data we can all collect of these sorts of schemes and how they perform, not only socially, the social capital you can build through doing things better, but also economically, how you can create long-term value, both for the landowner, but also for people who invest in, buy a house or buy a business space there. In time, everyone benefits. It becomes, a more valuable and more prosperous place for all. So I think it is a changing world. I think, as I say, different kinds of landowner begin to wake up to the issues. the government is very keen to encourage more SME house builders back into the market again, to look at how they can sort of declug the planning system to make it easier for people to get consent and do things better. One of the recommendations of the 4B Commission was stewardship and how to encourage landowners to take a long-term interest in their land like the Duchy do, and how that can create better value and make nicer places for people to live. So I think it's very much a changing world, but I think the world is going, in the Prince's direction, and the value that he's created is now being recognised more widely.
Fantastic, thank you. And there was one other question about trees, but you did partially answer that, I think, in your presentation. Do you have anything else left to say on the apparent absence of trees?
Early comments on Nansledan have said just the lack of trees is a disappointment, and it is, but that was deliberate, because as I say, until you got built form, trees won't grow there. We now have the Duchy forester, Geraint Williams, who's a font of knowledge on these things, working with us to make sure that more trees are planted now in the earlier phases to help green them up, because you can now, there's enough built form to give them protection from the wind. Going forward, there's much more built area now, we can start to plant trees more quickly as the next phases start to evolve. But another, apart from the wind, also the dust of construction traffic, trees don't do very well in that. So you want that to be finished before you put the trees in, really. So I think over the next 2 or 3 years, people will see a lot more trees going in there. And certainly the ambition is to put a lot more trees in. And the idea is the community orchard is taking off now, the edible streets is taking off. Residents wanted to take part in that and to get involved in collectives for fruit picking and apple presses and those sorts of things. So it is very much an evolving picture, but going forward, you'll definitely see the streets greening up over time.
Wonderful. I really hope that post-lockdown we can sort of organise a walking tour. That would be so fantastic to have your expert advice in sort of in Nansledan. Yeah, it would be fantastic. So thank you, Hugh, and thanks to everyone who's joined today, and have an excellent rest of the day, everybody. Hopefully not too much of a sticky one for everyone in London. It's pretty intolerable. But thank you so much, and have a good day. Bye, Hugh.
Bye bye.
Bye, Harriet.
Thank you, Hugh. Bye.